let's get sewing. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Are you ready to conquer your sewing frustrations? Then you're in the right place. Make sure you watch all the way to the end to learn everything you need to know about curved seams. Then click subscribe so that you never miss any of my video tutorials and learn how to conquer your sewing projects. Let's get sewing. Alright, so talking about curves, there are two different kind of curves. This is a concave curve, and I think of that because it's kind of like a cave, versus a convex curve, which goes outward this way. And they're treated just a little bit differently. So let's talk about each of them. I'm going to talk first about the concave curve. This you're probably going to see more often in garment construction. Think like a neckline or the arm side of a sleeveless garment where you need to put a facing or a lining against the outside of the garment. And so you would sew the seam like this, but if we just try to turn it without doing anything to that seam, do you see how that fabric on the inside now has to stretch from being this way to being this way? And it just doesn't quite want to do it. You might be able to force it with an iron. This is linen. It's a lot more forgiving than some fabrics, but it just does not want to lay quite right. So here's what we do about that. First of all, think about this. If this was a neckline or an arm side, you would not want all of that bulk up here around your neck, under your arm. So the first thing we want to do is just trim away some of the fabric. And I have a couple different pairs of scissors that I like to use for that because they have a nice tip on them that's really good for getting in here. Any scissors will work, but if you have some with a finer tip, it's very nice for cutting this away. So I'm just going to take these and I'm going to take one of the seam allowances. Now here's what you want to do. Think wide to the world. So if this was the outside of my garment, like my front, and this was the neckline, we want the wide to be what the world would see. They're not going to see it, but think wide to the world. So the outside of the garment, we're going to leave that seam allowance wide, and the inside we're going to trim. So we'll think of this as our lining. And we're just going to trim it a little, well, you could do it about in half. I'm doing a little more than half here of that seam allowance and trimming it away. Making sure not to clip anything else in the process. And that's why I like these pointed, narrow points on the scissors. They just slide in there nicely and get that clipped. And sometimes it takes short little snips like this to get everything trimmed away. So now we have less fabric there. When we turn this seam, there just won't be quite as much bulk inside that seam allowance. But we still have the issue that it doesn't want to lay flat. And so the solution to that is to put some tiny clips in this seam allowance so that it can stretch. Now this takes a little bit of practice and eyeballing and trial and error till you get a feel for it. But with a curve like this, I want my snips to be at least an inch, I'm thinking more like a ½ an inch apart. Now some people will just go and clip the whole thing a ½ an inch apart, and that's perfectly fine, but let me show you a little bit more refined technique that's going to give us an even smoother seam. So this part of our curve is basically straight. I'm not going to worry right here at the very corner, but here where it starts to curve, I am going to make some clips. Let me do this side first so you can see. And I am going to snip this to within an 1/8 of an inch, maybe 2 or 3 threads of the seam. And again, this is where my fine tip scissors help me to see what I'm doing and get right in there. So I'm going to go all along here, about 1/2 inch apart. Maybe I'm doing more like 3/4 of an inch, I guess. You don't have to measure it. Like I said, some trial and error and practice, and you'll get the feel for it. And if you turn it and it's not enough, you go back and make some more clips. Not a big deal. And if you have there aren't really too many clips. Don't worry about doing too many. So I'm going to continue to go around this curve about 3/4 of an inch apart. So I've put my little snips in here just to within an 1/8 inch, 2 to 3 threads of my seam. Now I'm going to go back, and in between each of these clips, I'm going to clip my wider seam allowance, again, to within an 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 stitches of the edge. And by staggering them between the two seam allowances, I'm less likely to get flat spots on the outside of the seam, and I'll show you in just a minute when we turn our seam. It's a little bit hard. I'm trying to find where my other clips are. Okay. So now I have clipped both seam allowances, and you can do a little test. Do you see how I can straighten my seam now to be a straight line without any puckering in my seam allowance? That tells me that I've done enough clipping. So now we can turn our seam or a fabric right side out, and do you see how much nicer that lays than before when we tried to turn that seam? Now if you don't have enough clips, you're going to get a few spots where this wants to try and lay straight. Just go back in there and make a little clip at that point where you see that happening. And then once we have all that clipped, we take our iron and just very carefully, with a few little shots of steam, ooh, hot, we would iron that, and we have a perfectly rounded turned seam. The clips are able to flay out this way and stretch where we need them to be inside our garment, and that is what you would see from the outside. So that's our concave curve. Now let me show you what we're going to do with our convex curve. Much the same way, we're going to trim our seam allowance down. Now think of this, I said that the concave was seen more often in garment sewing, but this could be the edge of a collar, a flap for a pocket, something like that. So think about it as that type of thing. Same rule applies here. We want to get rid of some of that bulk, so we're going to think of our lining versus the outside of the garment. We want wide to the world, so the lining or the facing, we're going to trim that seam allowance by half or even a little more than half. And again, just some short little snips. It doesn't have to be pretty. This will be on the inside of your clothing. If the fabric was very sheer, you'd want to be a little more careful about this. But on a sheer garment, you probably would want to bind the seams as well, but that's a whole different lesson. So we're going to snip that off. Now, if we were to turn this without doing any clipping or notching, it would turn, but we now have, and you can't really see as well as I can feel, that fabric is having to bunch up in there. because we have taken, and it doesn't want to lay very smooth. See how we have flat spots here? We've taken that wider seam allowance and we're trying to cram it into a smaller arch. So here's what we're going to do on our convex seam. We want to cut out notches and get rid of some of the excess fabric. And so I'm going to start here where the curve starts to come around, and just like our clips, we're going to cut a little notch to within 1/8 of an inch, just a few threads of our seam, and you can see it's a tiny little V. And this is actually the same as the convex curve because I cut the fabric. So I'm thinking 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch apart, just like the other one. But you have to gauge. On a flatter seam, they can be farther, flatter curve, they can be farther apart. And again, it'll take some playing, but you're just going to cut your little V's out of the seam allowance. And then once you get to where the curve kind of straightens out, you can stop. And then just like with our clips, we're going to go back to the beginning and we're going to do some in the other seam allowance, and we're going to stagger them between the notches in our first seam. But again, just clipping that, and I have gotten the feel of it now. If you needed to, you could turn it over and just kind of look where you need your notch to be. If that, you know, is more comfortable for you, if you're worried about cutting into your seam. Okay, so we now have this notched so that those V's can come together and allow this fabric to lay inside the seam without making the bumps that it did before. And so now, when we turn our fabric to the right side, it will lay much flatter than it did before. And you can see I have a point right here. That tells me I need another clip here to kind of let that lay a little bit flat. So I'm going to turn it back to the inside. My last clip was on the narrow seam allowance. I'm going to make one more clip in the wide, and just for good measure, again, I keep calling these clips. I need to distinguish. These are notches. You can't really do too many, so I wouldn't worry about that. Now, when I turn it back, I've smoothed out that point, which is exactly what I wanted to do. And so now we have a much smoother convex curve. We would come in with our iron, give it a little shot of steam, and there we have it. This we could work at. There are other techniques to work on that, which again for another video, but now you have your convex seam nice and smooth. Now one more thing I wanted to go over with you, because for years I could never remember. I had to look at my instructions to think, do I clip or do I notch? For some reason that didn't stick in my head. So let me show you what I came up with. Our convex seam got the clips. But what I remember is, you see how the outline of this seam goes this direction? If I were to open my hand, it mimics that seam. And in between my fingers are notches. And it might seem silly, but that's how I remember. If the seam is shaped this way or convex, it gets notches. Otherwise, it gets clipped. So I hope you found that helpful. I hope that will help to make your sewing a little bit smoother and a little bit easier. And I hope that you have a great day. Thanks for joining me.